I wanted to welcome you to our session on measuring the employee experience. As mentioned, my name is Rufino Chiong, and I am the head of product for TI People. For those of you who are unaware, TI People is an advisory and benchmarking firm, and specifically, what we focus on is helping companies better deliver and design employee experiences. And I'm really excited to be part of this conference because we really see employee experience as an emerging use case for people analytics, especially as it relates to measuring experience, and then perhaps more importantly, deriving the insights for us to take action. And so what I want to do is to share with you this co-creation process, which we undertook with about 40 different organizations, where we had three objectives. Number one was to better understand how do we even measure EX in the first place. Secondly, we had a goal to create one metric that organizations can use to benchmark employee experience, which is what we call the Employee Experience Index, or EXI for short. And then finally, what we also wanted to do was to share with you some of the insights from that process, especially in terms of what it revealed from the data of how employees perceive employee experience, their priorities, and also what they expect from employers. So what I want to do is to just jump right in. As mentioned, if you do have any questions for me, please feel free to put it into the message box, and then we'll answer them at the very end in the Q&A part of this session. So from a broader holistic point of view, we see that employee experience is becoming such an emerging topic because many would say, if you look at the academia, is that we are now in the middle of being in an experienced economy. And this started about 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, really first in the CX space, so the customer experience space, where consumers were telling businesses that they purchased from that it was not just a quality product or service that they wanted, but they also expected a superior customer experience as well. And if you fast forward to, let's say, the past several years, the lines between we being as consumers and we being as employees have also blurred as well, such that now as employees, we are also expecting superior employee experiences. And so the graphic on the right-hand side is just to show that in the past, employees were essentially exchanging their time to employers for compensation. But in today's world, it's not just an exchange of time for money, but it's also an exchange of time for a superior employee experience. And so we've seen employee experience being a very hot topic in the last, let's say, 1 or 2 years. But what's interesting is that in the past several months, during this time of uncertainty, we've actually seen perhaps even an increased focus by organizations on EX. One very interesting data point is we did a survey of business leaders, and nearly 40% of business leaders would say and expect that their EX budgets would actually increase even during this time of economic turbulence. And so if you think about the headwinds of the past several years and now, organizations are trying to compete on experience. And if we're trying to compete on experience, the best way to sort of take lessons learned from EX is for us to take some lessons from the CX space. Because in many ways, we can learn from what happened in CX and follow the CX footsteps. And I tell this story on the next page to give you an example of what we've learned from CX. And what you see on the page here is a very fuzzy teddy bear. And this teddy bear happens to work for Southwest Airlines. And the story goes, and I'll keep it very short, is that Grayson is an 8-year-old boy. And at the end of this last past year, he actually unfortunately lost his teddy bear on his Southwest airline flight. And even worse was that Southwest Airlines could not find Grayson's original teddy bear. So what Southwest did is they actually purchased Grayson a brand new teddy bear, as you can see on the slide here. And they even decided to make up a bit of a story to tell Grayson how this teddy bear actually works at Southwest Airlines, and how this teddy bear was now going to live with Grayson. And so then they mailed the teddy bear to Grayson, as well as these fun photographs of the teddy bear supposedly working at Southwest. And what happened was this generated some good PR for Southwest Airlines. But if you take a step back, it does raise a few important questions, because we have to ask ourselves, was doing this, so taking the time to buy the teddy bear, to take these photographs, was that actually the best use of time by these Southwest employees to improve the customer experience for their customers? And secondly, how do you even quantify what was the business impact for doing this? And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying what Southwest did was good or bad, but I tell the story because it highlights the two critical challenges if organizations want to compete on experience. And what's even more interesting is that these two challenges are much more pronounced in the EX space than in the CX space. And the first challenge has to do with the fact that if you think about the entire ecosystem of the employee experience, it is huge. You think about all the different interactions that an employee has when they're working, whether it be their colleagues at work, their manager. You think about the different touch points, whether it's the office equipment, the office itself. And then you also think about what they interact for. So it could be when they first interview with the organization. It could be the moment of when they first start their first day in the organization. And it could be those journeys of when I onboard, performance management, so forth and so forth. But if you compare this entire employee ecosystem for EX, it is so much more complex than the CX space. Because in CX, best case scenario, it is very, very unlikely that any given consumer would interact with a company every single day. But if you think about from an employee standpoint, employees are interacting with the employer almost all the time. And so the challenge for people analytics is that how do we condense this entire employee ecosystem into those moments and journeys that matter most for employees? And then the second challenge is that even if we can prioritize those most important moments and journeys from that big EX ecosystem, we also have to figure out how do we quantify the impact of EX to business outcomes, whether it be in engagement, productivity, or any other metric for that matter. And it's really these two critical challenges of how do we prioritize the most important experience moments for employees, and how do we quantify the impact of EX to business outcomes that drove us and these other 40 companies that we partner with to figure out what is the best way to measure employee experience. And what we did is that we created this metric called the Employee Experience Index, which is called the EXI. And specifically, when we create this metric, we wanted to make sure that the EXI metric could accomplish three things. Number one, we wanted to make sure that the EXI metric could become the single KPI which organizations can use to benchmark the quality of their employee experience. Number two, we also want to make sure that this metric could be used to understand how organizations are performing in experience as perceived by employees. And number three, we also want to make sure that this metric could be used to understand which particular employee moments and journeys have the most influence on EX and business outcomes such as engagement. So what I want to do now is to dive into the methodology. Now, what I will say is that this is probably one of the most complex pages for this session. So I'm going to spend some time really unpacking the methodology we used to figure out how to measure employee experience. And the best way to sort of parse it apart is to first look at the left-hand side of the page, because there was a qualitative component, and then the right-hand side of the page because there was a quantitative component. But we'll start with the qualitative first, because that's where the whole process started. So we began with trying to map out and document the entire employee experience ecosystem. So meaning to say, all the possible moments and journeys that employee experiences as they interact with their employer. So it would be moments like my job interview, or my first day at work, or receiving my performance review, as well as the journeys that these moments would be linked to across the employee lifecycle, whether it be I join a company, I onboard, I develop performance management, and then I leave. So that was the whole big ecosystem. Now, of course, while we had documented the entire EX ecosystem, we do need to prioritize and figure out, what are those moments and journeys that would have most influence on EX. And so that's where we started with this co-creation process with about 40 different global organizations. And you can see some of the companies that we worked with to qualitatively narrow down to what they believe were the 258 most important moments. And then we had a follow-up process where we conducted essentially sprint sessions to narrow those moments down to 54 moments on the right-hand side of the page. And once we had these 54 moments, that's where it now started the quantitative process of our methodology. So what we did is that for these 54 moments, we also grouped them into 12 journeys. We conducted a pilot survey to about 13,000 employees to try to understand how they perceive the employee experience for each of these 54 moments and each of these 12 journeys. And it was actually a single question. So for each moment, such as, for example, my first day, we would ask a customer satisfaction or employee satisfaction score. And then for each journey that these moments belong to, we would ask an NPS score. So it would be, for example, a satisfaction score for the moment of I joined, so the moment of my first day, and then we ask an NPS score for the journey that first day belonged to of onboarding. We ask NPS score for that particular journey. So that was the first quantitative step. Moving on to the next column there on the right, now that we had the performance for different moments and journeys, whether it's NPS or satisfaction, we also want to ask a more question about what was the employee's overall experience, as well as engagement questions such as discretionary effort, intent to stay, which therefore became our outcome variables. So once we had that, we're able to conduct regression analysis to figure out which moments and journeys had the most influence in terms of impacting the employee's perception of overall employee experience, as well as their engagement. And then finally, by using both the performance as measured by satisfaction NPS, as well as the influence that these moments and journeys would have to EX and engagement, we would then compile it together into one unique KPI called the EXI, or Employee Experience Index, that would be able to be used to benchmark an organization's experience quality. Now, one thing that I did want to clarify a little bit is in our research process, in this co-creation process, we wanted to provide a bit more precision in terms of how we think about moments and journeys. So for the moments, we actually classified it into two different types. On the left-hand side, we have what they call the moments of truths. And these are those very highly emotionally loaded moments, whether it would be my interview with the company, I'm receiving feedback about my interview, I'm negotiating the job offer, or perhaps my first day at work. At the same time, though, we also have a different type of employee moment, which is what we call the effortless moments on the top right-hand side of the page. And these moments are very much about moments that employees will find either very painful, and so therefore we need to make it as easy as possible. So such as the process for submitting my application online, the process for getting my IT equipment. All the moments that potentially can be very painful, and it tends to be much more about different processes like either HR processes or processes that other functions will need to perform. So we have these two types of moments, and then finally we'll group these moments into a broader hierarchy of the journeys that they will relate to. So for example, the moments of truth of interviewing, getting the feedback, getting the job offer, that would be belonging to the journey of I join, whereas you have other journeys that relate to the employee lifecycle, like develop my skills, performance management, and so forth. So I spent a lot of time talking about the methodology. What I now want to do for the rest of the conversation is to give you a view in terms of the insights that we're able to derive from this methodology of measuring employee experience. And so the first thing we wanted to do was, because we had those NPS scores and satisfaction scores of different moments and journeys that employees would experience, we got a pretty good sense of which are the areas where employees feel like they are receiving a superior experience, and which of those areas where they don't feel they're receiving a good experience. And the key takeaway here is that if you look at the journey NPS scores, on average, it seems that organizations are performing much better in the early stage journeys. So the journeys related to joining the company as well as onboarding the company. Whereas if you look at the middle stage journeys and the late stage journeys like leaving, that's the area where experience tends to perform less well. And so in that co-creation process with those 40 different companies, we had several hypotheses of why this is the case. The first one is we do believe that organizations do tend to place more emphasis on early stage journeys because they want to make sure that the employee gets off to a good start. And actually, this is pretty consistent with even the CX space, where a classic complaint in CX is that we always treat new customers much better than current and existing customers. So that was sort of one hypothesis. The other hypothesis that we also talked about as well is that in many ways, it is actually much easier for organizations to focus on those early stage journeys, because those journeys like joining, onboarding are very discrete. Whereas if you start going to the middle stage journeys like development, objectives, performance management, they tend to sort of get all jumbled up into one big mass. And so therefore, it's harder for organizations to provide sort of discrete focus on those middle journeys. But what we would say from this data here is that if you're looking to prioritize where to focus on based on where employees feel the experience is worse, what we recommend is the focus should be on those middle stage journeys. So that was the dimension that we used looking at the experience of employees. The other wrinkle that we wanted to put into this analysis was putting now the wrinkle of the manager experience. And so what's pretty cool here is now we're looking at different moments, but from two perspectives. So on the left-hand side is what is the manager experience with a particular moment in terms of the support they're getting from human resources. And on the right-hand side is the same moment, but that is the perspective of what is the employee's experience as it relates to getting support from their manager. And so when you combine the analysis together, what you see is a bit of a number of gaps. So specifically, what we found was that employees tended to feel that their experience with managers, when it relates to setting objectives or having that compensation conversation, they do not feel they're getting enough support from the managers. And making it worse, on the left-hand side of the page, is that for those same moments, managers don't feel that they're getting enough support from HR. And so again, coming up with different recommendations and trying to prioritize, what we would say is that another potential area that organizations need to put more focus on in terms of employee experience would be the moment of setting objectives as well as communicating pay, both from the perspective of how managers can better support employees, but also from the perspective of how HR can better support managers to support those employees. So that was the analysis that we did in terms of a snapshot view of some of the findings that we had, purely looking at the perception of employees. So based on satisfaction scores and NPS, what were those moments and journeys where employees felt that they were having a better experience? What are those moments and journeys that employees felt they're getting worse experience? And so as one way to prioritize your focus would be less focus on those areas where we are perhaps delivering a lesser experience for employees. But another lens that we can take in terms of prioritizing which specific employee moments and journeys to focus on is to focus on those moments that have more impact on EX and engagement. So this is done through the regression analysis. Because we had those outcome variables on overall EX as well as engagement, we could actually perform regression analysis on which moments had significant impact, and of those moments, what is the relative maximum potential leverage we can get by investing in those moments. So what we found is there were 8 employee moments that we uncovered that had impact on both EX and engagement. Now, what I want to be really clear about is that we certainly found moments that we could statistically prove had impact on EX, and we also found moments that had impact on engagement, but in total we found 8 that had impact on both EX and engagement. And if you sort of take a high-level glance at what were the commonalities of those moments, it tended to be 2 things. Number one is those early stage moments, such as around onboarding and joining. They tend to have impact both on EX and engagement. And then anything around performance management also had impact on EX and engagement. So looking at the relative impact of moments to EX and engagement and the influence it has could be another way that we can think about how do we prioritize. But there's one more way, and to me, this is probably the one that's most fun, which is we also believe that another lens that you should take in terms of prioritizing what to focus on to prove EX is perhaps we should spend more time and more energy on those moments and journeys that create more word of mouth. So let me give you sort of the background story in terms of how we did this analysis. So from a survey design standpoint, we would ask a question, NPS or CSAT, about the different moments and journeys. So, tell me about how satisfied you were with your first day, and so forth. Now, for each question, that was a satisfaction question or NPS question that the employee answered, we also give them the opportunity to provide some free text commentary. And we hypothesize that we can use this free text commentary as a proxy for whether the employee would then say something within their colleagues and friends. So if, for example, an employee was willing to say something and write commentary on a survey, they are also very likely should have had said something to their friends and colleagues. So we use the free text commentary as a proxy for word of mouth. The second component of this was when we actually tried to impact on word of mouth, it was actually a bit trickier than expected. And we actually ended up triangulating 3 different distinct insights here. The first one is we wanted to find out what were those moments that if the employee actually experienced that moment, they also talked about it. And that's the size of the bubble on the chart there. Another dimension of word of mouth, though, is if they did say something about it, how much did they say about it? So we looked at the average word count and character size of different moments and journeys. And then finally, we also want to see, well, how often do employees actually even experience that moment or journey in the first place? So by combining those 3 sets of data, we essentially created a word of mouth index, if you will. And then it allowed us to prioritize which journeys tended to generate the most word of mouth. And they happen to be the ones around performance, onboarding, objectives, and growing my skills. So if you wanted to add in an additional lens to prioritize which moments and journeys should I prioritize in improving employee experience, if you use word of mouth as a criteria, then that will lead you to performance, onboarding, objectives, and growing my skills. One final sort of fun analysis we did is we wanted to test an insight in the CX space and see if it applies to EX as well. And that particular hypothesis is that when people experience a negative experience, they are very likely to say something. But if someone experienced something that was positive, they are not that likely to say something. That is the case in the CX space, and it's also very similar in the EX space as well, as you can see here. So what we try to do here is to say, if someone had a negative experience, did they say something? If they had a positive experience, did they say something? And in general, the ones who experience positive experiences don't really say too much about what happened. And so one final takeaway from the word of mouth analysis is that if you are spending the effort and energy to try to create and generate positive experiences for employees, we should also try to have a mechanism where employees can share and talk about it, because otherwise we're not getting the full impact of the investments we're making in trying to improve employee experiences. So we have covered a lot of slides. So I think this would be a good time just for me to summarize the insights so far before we get into the final 3 slides and then the question and answer segment. So the first thing is that we use the methodology of measuring EX to first understand which employee moments and journeys employees are having a positive or negative experience based on NPS and CSAT. Number 2 is that we'll use regression analysis to figure out of those moments and journeys, which ones have the most influence on EX as well as engagement. And then finally, we also did some analysis to figure out of those moments and journeys, which ones are more likely to either create buzz when something positive happens, and very likely to create noise when something negative happens. So those were the 3 inputs, and we used these 3 inputs to then create the employee experience index, which is the one big score that we can use to benchmark a company's performance in EX. So let me describe a little bit in terms of how we create the index and what are the components. If we start on the middle part of the page, the EX is actually a composite of 3 scores, so 3 parts. There's the component around moment of truth, so looking at those emotionally loaded moments that we talked about, such as the job interview, receiving feedback, negotiating compensation. We also had a composite around the effortless moments, so how well is a company performing on making it easy for employees. And then finally, we will have the journey scores. So sort of looking at the different stages in employee lifecycle, like onboarding, performance management, and so forth. Where that analysis that we did just before really becomes important is it gives us the ability to actually calculate the score. So for example, when we think about those moments of truth, we know how the company is performing based on the CSAT score that the employee has given each moment. What we then also could do is add in a relative weight for which moments are more important, because those moments that have influence on EX and engagement should have more weighting, as well as those moments who generate more word of mouth. And so therefore, each moment would essentially be the CSAT score that they received, plus a multiplier to determine the relative importance. And we added it together, all the moments, into a combined moment of truth score. That's the same process we did for the effortless moments, and then finally the same for the journey score The only difference being instead of measuring performance by CSAT, we measured it by NPS. So we talked a lot about, and this is the final data slide, we talked a lot about how we could improve employee experience by looking at the employee experience moments and journeys themselves. So how satisfied were the employees, the relative influence that they had on EX and engagement, as well as the influence on word of mouth. But another question that I think is really important to ask as well is, are there investments that we can make within HR or EX or other parts of the organization, or investments in the ways of working that can enable us to also achieve and support higher EX for our organization? And so what we did here as part of the analysis is we did a separate assessment of each organization's maturity in terms of the processes and ways of working for journey design, maturity for the way that they go about collaborating internally and breaking silos, as well as the maturity for measurement. And what we did is that when we looked at the maturity of design, collaboration, and measurement, those organizations with higher maturity on those three elements also had higher EXI scores as well. So the final lesson learned here is that if we do want to improve the employee experience for our employees, it's not just about improving the experience itself, but it's also about making those internal investments in terms of journey design, internal collaboration, and measurement. And with that, what I want to do is to begin to transition into the question and answer phase of this presentation. What I'll do is let me summarize the key takeaways, and then we will start taking some questions and answers. So we began the story with that people are expecting not just superior customer experiences from companies to do business with, but now also the same of their employers. And so therefore, as companies are starting to compete on experience, it does require two critical challenges to solve for. How do we prioritize what to focus on within the entire EX ecosystem? And number two, how do we quantify the impact of EX to business outcomes? And then finally, looking at the data from our measurement of EX through the Employee Experience Index, we were able to identify some recommendations. Number one, you should pay more attention to those medium stage working moments and journeys because that tended to have lower CSAT and NPS scores. We believe that managers are looking at their experience scores, are crying for more help from HR in terms of how to communicate pay and setting objectives. If we're looking at it and trying to prioritize based on which moments and journeys have the most influence on EX and engagement, then it would tend to be the early stage moments and performance management. It is important based on a word of mouth analysis to know that if we're spending all this time and effort to improve EX, if there are positive experiences, employees probably won't say anything. So we need to have mechanisms for employees to share those positive experiences. And then finally, if we do want to improve EX, it's not just about improving EX itself, but it's also about making some of those internal investments, specifically around journey design, internal collaboration, and measurement, because what it shows is that if you have higher maturity there, it does lead to higher employee experience. So with that, let me transition it to the Q&A portion of this session.
Rufino, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff, a really fascinating analysis. And before I pitch in with a couple of questions, Agnieszka has had a couple of questions. So firstly, what technology are you using for the analysis, and is it automated?
Yeah, so I think the technology piece, there is essentially two parts to it. And the automation, there's two parts of it. And it does vary by each organization that took part in the pilot. So from a data collection standpoint, because it was a pilot, most organizations tended to use manual collection. So this would be Any standard surveying tool, ranging from as basic as SurveyMonkey, something a bit more complex like Qualtrics, for example, to collect that data. But it was sort of manual triggering, where we just took a sample of employees and then we put them through the survey process. Now, a number of organizations would say, we believe in EXI, the pilot made sense. Now, after the pilot, that's when we want to invest in the automated triggering. And that's where you can imagine scenarios where you can have data from your HRS system, your ATS system, your LMS that would indicate that an employee has experienced certain moments, such as your workday would say, these are a sample of employees who just joined. Great, now let's trigger a survey to them about their joining and onboarding experience. So that would be then the automated piece. But the lesson learned from the pilot companies is that when it's just a pilot, there's pretty much too much effort to do automated triggering of surveys. What they would recommend is to do the pilot first, establish the business case within the different business leaders, and once you do that, then is when you want to invest in automated triggering of the surveys. So that's sort of part one of the question. In terms of the analysis of the data, it was fairly standard data analysis tools, mostly using SPSS for the regression analysis. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Rufino. And Agnieszka's other question was around, are you using any external benchmarks in your analysis? Are you aware, and second part of that, are you aware of any technologies, platform sources for external benchmarking for EX?
Yep. So, and again, this is not meant to, necessarily recommend, platforms or another, or sources of data or another. But what we will say is, I think one area that could be pretty exciting is actually some of the data from Microsoft Workplace Analytics, and I don't say just because it was the speaker before me, but the WPA data is actually very useful in two ways. The first way is that it actually can help us more smartly identify the right set of employees to survey. Because, for example, when you think about your LTS, it can tell you that an employee has done this online course in the LMS, which is great. But there are many other learning moments that we wouldn't really know in any system that the employee had that experience. So, for example, having a one-on-one with a manager, or attending a internal networking event, or having a meeting with their manager's manager. But in the WPA data, because they pull data from sort of Outlook activity, email activity, as well as even the subject lines from your calendar invites, you now have a much better way of identifying those more hidden experience moments. And then you can then select those people and then be able to be smarter in terms of serving them. On the other component is that once you get the data, WPA could be another great way to add to the sort of holistic listening. And the reason I say that is because if, for example, we conduct a regression analysis and we can show that, for example, employees who say they have a poor career experience, potentially for root cause analysis, we may identify that the time with managers is important, is an important driver of that experience, the career experience, the exposure to people outside their function, exposure to the manager's manager could also be drivers of that career experience. And if that proves to be the case, then you could imagine creating a index that is a combination of the EX score, so the NPS or CSAT score on career, as well as those moments or the root causes identified by the WPA that are proven from regression analysis to impact career, like time with managers, exposure outside your function, and so forth.
Great. Thanks, Rufino. That's a couple of really good answers there, and great questions, Agnieszka, as well. I like this question that's come in here, and I'm going to nuance it slightly. So the question is around who usually owns employee experience in organisation, and where should it sit, in your opinion? So I think I'm going to slightly nuance that. In the organisations that are doing this really well, EX, and I see in many respects the whole EX conversation being a few years behind people analytics, perhaps in terms of maturity and in terms of teams being embedded within organisations and everything else. But in the companies that are doing this well, and I know many of those are companies that you work with at TI People, who owns employee experience? Where does it sit within the
Yeah.
organisation? And particularly, what is the sort of size and composition of the teams that are working on this?
Yeah, and this is a bit of a philosophical answer as well. So the philosophical answer is just like in the CX space. Um, there's no one function that is even able to own EX, right? Because there are certainly moments that HR can disproportionately control and impact, such as, for example, the example I gave about supporting managers with compensation conversations. But there are other functions also involved in EX as well. So when we talk about did you or did you not receive your computer on your first day of work, that actually is more of an IT issue than an HR issue. So from a broad philosophical perspective is EX really needs to involve the entire organization, not just the usual suspects like HR, people analytics, and so forth. That being said, what we have seen is what the function that primarily has been driving EX is HR with people analytics. Those tend to be the people that we've been most working with. But they know is that they can only take it so far. But what they want to do is to take the lead in driving EX, much like thinking about a few years ago where marketing took the lead in terms of driving CX. And those teams, tend to be fairly small. I mean, on average, and this is not meant to be any benchmark whatsoever, but on average, we tend to work with about like 5 or 6 core people in HR and people analytics, as well as usually some type of IT partner. Because if you are thinking about automated surveying, pulling data from your Workday or HRS, then you need that person involved as well.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, organizer. I mean, it's interesting yesterday because I don't know if you saw, but Patrick Coolan from ABN AMRO, the head of people analytics there, was talking about how they do the text analysis around some of the comments that they're doing on a regular basis. And what was interesting was how he said they work hand in hand with Luke Sambesky's EX team. But as you said, they need to drive those insights out to people in IT and facilities management, for example, because ultimately, it's their responsibility to take action on the insights that are being collected, which I guess is similar if we think of marketing sort of owning the kind of analytics and the process in which they do customer experience, but then very much is people at the front line in sales, customer service who are actually actioning some of those insights that they're getting. So it's a fascinating topic, Rufino, and thanks very much for joining. We've reached the end of the session now.